Today we're going to highlight one of the unique aspects of our project, the Property Value Protection Program, and monitoring property values in particular. And we want to address some information that we believe is confusing to the public and in some cases inaccurate. And this will be the subject of a council presentation tonight by one of the program's critics. Recently we commissioned an independent study by a third-party subject matter expert, Property Valuators Consulting, Inc., to look at the Port Hope and Cobourg real estate markets and to do a comparison. PVCI monitored, evaluated, and interpreted data over a 10-year period, evaluating different factors that fluctuate like property values, sales figures, and market conditions. A few days ago we received the preliminary results from PVCI, and we thought it would be timely to share them with you. In about a month or so we expect to receive the final report, and after we have an opportunity to brief our key stakeholders at the municipality and at the real estate board, we will then share the report with the community at large. Port Hope has an active real estate market, and like any Ontario community has its unique features and quirks. We will have Murray Visser here today, the president of PVCI, discuss the unique aspects of the Port Hope market and compare it with the Cobourg market. And I think you will find some of his insights very, very interesting.
We were commissioned to do this work, but the one thing that we did do, as you correctly point out, we compared Port Hope and Cobourg, and we took a look at everything that happened in those two markets over that period of time. We looked at average sale prices, but we wanted to dive down a little bit deeper, and that's what the results of this analysis will talk to. And we looked at other related data as we could. Our study was independent. We were hired by the program, obviously, but our findings, we were not asked to find out anything in particular. We didn't actually even know what was expected to be found out by this, so we just we just took a look at the data, let it fall where it may. Once we did all that, we did have a third-party statistician again. We did not show him our findings. We showed him our raw data, asked him to run some certain analysis, and he did that and confirmed our findings. We looked at these two things, these two communities, and after we ran it all, we came up with some conclusions that we'll now discuss. So, from the period 2001 to 2010, a 10-year period, what we found is that there was a 53.6% increase in average. These are average house prices in Port Hope, and 58.2% in Cobourg. So there's a small divergence there. At the beginning of the study period, the gap was about 10,000. By the end of the study period, it was about 30,000. So that takes into account inflationary pressures and all that kind of thing as well, but it also accounts for actual changes in the two communities. Now, the critical part of the study is now, is what we find here. There were, in fact, differences between the two communities in terms of average prices, and these can be attributed to a number of things. Some of these things could be, easily quantifiable and measured. Other things are a little bit less easy to measure and quantify, but they are no less important. For example, in Cobourg, you have the hospital that came online around the beginning of the study period. Has a tremendous impact on average house prices. Cobourg has a waterfront that has certain benefits to the community, and to people from the outside, it obviously also has some benefits. There was a lot more economic development in Cobourg during that period of time, and we're talking about commercial development, residential development, and not to nearly the same extent industrial. There's a difference in tax rates and development charges between the two communities, which leads directly to a difference in prices as well. So we're talking about the annual tax bill that you get, and we're talking about the cost of building a home with development charges and so forth. And that is also a key number. When you look at all these other things, they led to a greater level of development in Cobourg than in Port Hope. And as a result, the quality and the age of the housing stock in those two communities became distinctly different. And this also led to a difference in the house prices between the two communities. And then we have a certain amount of the gap that we just simply cannot identify and clearly explain where it came from. It comes from a whole host of different things, and we can't say exactly what that was. These could be things, housing characteristics that we can't capture, you know, via rail service levels and so on. There's a whole bunch of things that we could all sit here and speculate on, and it comes from there. We just don't know what exactly that is. This is such a cool little thing here. Okay, here's some very interesting little factoids that we pulled out as well. If you look here, during that time period, 1,086 increase in the population of Port Hope, and during that same period, over 3,000 in Cobourg. So Cobourg during that time period was in fact increasing at a much higher rate than Port Hope was. The median age is also going up, which may be a reflection of the condos down at the south end of Cobourg. We didn't dive down quite that deep to see, you know, we didn't do a survey door to door or anything like that, but you can see that the average age of people is increasing in Cobourg. There's a lot more condos going on in Cobourg. Those two might go hand in hand. Some interesting points here. In Port Hope, your average development charge, or not your average, your development charges $19,408, and in Cobourg, $12,000. So you've got a $7,000 gap in the development charges in one community compared to the other. All things being equal, you're going to have more development in the community that has lower development charges. The more development is going to lead to greater investment in other areas, commercial, industrial, you know, whatever it is, educational as well. That is for the existing part of Cobourg. The new developments on the east end of Cobourg actually are changing a little bit, and they're, because they have to bring in new servicing, they've seen fit to have higher development charges in that area. But over in the areas that cover this historical period, the development charges were lower in Cobourg. Here's the number that's really surprises quite a bit, and that is, if you look at the amount of development that took place in Port Hope during that period of time, there was just under $8 million in new home construction building permits issued in Port Hope. During the same period, it was almost 19 million in Cobourg, and that's quite a gap. The big number is the commercial gap, where there's a huge amount of commercial development going on in Cobourg, building permits, just massively bigger in Cobourg during that same period of time. I'm not 100% sure, I don't have my notes here, I believe that may include things like the hospital and the cost of building there. But regardless of the exact source of it, you've got 10 times the development taking place in Cobourg during that period of time. All that leads to higher tax base, a wider tax base for the community, which in fact allows you to lower the tax burden in Cobourg for the residential part of the assessment things. So that's the kind of thing that was happening in those two communities during that period of time. This is a very clear graph, just showing you what's happened to prices. So at the beginning of the study period, the average prices in the two communities were pretty much similar, bang on. They go up and down a little bit. They go pretty much in tandem. Around 2007, we start to see them diverge a little bit, and we found that to be something that we wanted to dig into deeper, obviously, which we did. And that's where we're talking about the findings that we talked about briefly before, which is the housing stock is changing in the two communities, more so in Cobourg than in Port Hope. Port Hope's housing stock remains the same. Cobourg is getting different, prices are higher. This is basically the data that was used to generate the chart on the previous page. But what you'll notice here is that even though during that period of time prices did increase more in Cobourg than they did in Port Hope, there were a number of times that they actually increased in Port Hope in a given year too. 2007 in particular, you can see they bumped up quite a bit. In Port Hope, 16% relative to 7% in the same year in Cobourg. So the lesson we learn here is that in any one year you can have anomalies. These are relatively small communities, all things considered, so that in any one year you can have prices vary one way or the other, and you're, you know, in the study period 4 out of the 10 years, prices actually increase more in Port Hope than they did in Cobourg. So take that for what it is, but we have to be careful when we look at any one year, because things do happen. And although our study period covered the period of 2000 to 2010, recently, because we were told that there might be some information presented at council this evening, we input our 2011 data into it. We have not yet had time to dig deeply into that. So we just have the averages here. We don't have all the linear and multiple regressions that we would typically do. We still have to input all the data from each of those transactions for the year. But what you find out is in 2011, it looks like the prices are diverging a little bit more again this year. But it's 1 year and it's a partial year. We haven't dug down deeper to find out why that is. We will within the next couple of weeks. So, as you know, tonight somebody's going to be presenting some information on price differences in Cobourg and Port Hope. And we've taken a look at what was being presented potentially. And, you know, we have a few things that we would like to observe. One of the key things that he presents is that in Port Hope there are fewer homes above $400,000 being sold in recent years, or what he defines as high-priced homes. We made the cutoff point of 400,000. It's an arbitrary number, but if you look here, there really has not been that much of a change in the number of high-priced homes selling in Port Hope during that period of time. There was in 2007, both communities really took off in that particular year. But really, you know, most years there wasn't any more than there are this year. So he's claiming that the averages are being driven down by the lack of high-end homes being sold in Port Hope. The numbers just don't support that. The numbers have not changed measurably at all. They have changed in Cobourg.
Is that sale and purchase?
Yes. Like these are successful transactions. Yeah. So in Cobourg, you do see that there's quite an increase in the number of high-end homes that are selling, and high-end being defined as price. And that's simply because the market is changing. That over the last few years, there's been several hundred new homes built in Cobourg. A lot of them are of the higher-end variety. A year or two after they're built, they hit the resale market, and so you start to see many more higher-end homes selling in Cobourg. Whereas Port Hope's inventory has remained essentially static during that period of time. So their high-end homes tend to be, for everything I say, there is an exception to the rule, but they tend to be century homes or bigger, older homes in downtown areas. So that inventory is not changing in numbers, so you're not going to see a change in the number of sales.
Sold, but how many were listed?
I don't know.
Isn't that the whole point of the exercise?
We'll get the questions in just
Yeah.
2 minutes.
So that's just one little trend there. Another point that was brought up was that our friends in the media and the stories that get printed and circulated have a direct impact on house prices in Port Hope and Cobourg. We tracked all the articles that we could, and this information was provided to us. We didn't read each of the 500 or 600, whatever it was, articles. But generally they're categorized as negative, positive, or neutral. And you can see that the numbers, with the exception of 2004, the number is fairly consistent. Generally they are perceived to be negative. However negative is defined, that's not I did not do that. But is that an impact on value? Does that have an influence? Possibly. This is where many of you may have already seen this graph from the gentleman that's presenting this evening, I think. We have access to all the data, and we look at it in great detail. We were not able to reproduce the graph that he has. We were able to reproduce these numbers here, but his numbers exclude everything over $250,000 in home sales, which is a rather significant part of the market. I think it was actually 40% of the homes sold were excluded from the data set. So I'm not sure what that means. What we did is we just took everything in the data set, and so that our numbers are consistent from year to year, we're studying the same numbers every year, and here's what we see. I mean, we start at a 0 baseline as opposed to 160. I mean, that looks like a dramatic drop, but really it's not much of a drop at all. Our numbers, when you take the whole data set, show that the price is pretty much constant. And the same thing holds true for the number of units sold. And this doesn't mean as much to most people, not to me either. It's just the volume of sales. So again, they're fairly consistent. Our numbers are similar in this year, but we were not able to reproduce all of the numbers because we can't tell what data set he is including or excluding there. This is what this is the whole point of the whole exercise. Yes, we saw that prices diverged between the two communities between 2000 and 2010. They're about $30,000 higher on average in Cobourg than in Port Hope at the end of 2010. Out of that $30,000, about 75% of that we could determine was from specific causes. And these are very specific things, such as tax rates. We can convert the tax rate number into a specific number on house prices, development charges, and more modern varied housing stock. And by that, we could actually measure things like homes that had more bathrooms, more bedrooms, double garages versus single or no garages, and those kinds of things. They lead directly to changes in house prices, and we could measure that. And then there's other factors that we know have a positive or a negative influence on prices. It's just not as easy to measure what that impact is. So for example, the hospital going up in Cobourg, that would have a positive impact on home prices. We just can't, the data is just not strong enough to suggest what degree that is. Commercial development is clearly going to have a positive influence on real estate values and job creation, especially when you get to these power centers and these retail developments. It provides a lot of job opportunities for students, second incomes and families, and so on. Again, it's really difficult to capture the exact amount that it influences values, but we know that it does. There are many studies that support that. The waterfront, again, in Cobourg would help support that. 25% of that $30,000, so about $7,500 on your average house. That's a number that we can't explain. Our data just does not tell us what that is. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that it could be. People are going to speculate on what it might be. They could be positive things, they could be negative things, they could be anything that we just simply cannot measure. So, basically, there are our findings. If anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
This is a very different study than the PVP program does on an ongoing basis. So on an ongoing basis, we get the data from we actually buy the data from Northumberland Hills Association of Realtors, and we get that data monthly, and that gives us much of the information that you're referring to. That gives us sales, that gives us number of listings, that gives us the ability to look at days on market every month. Cobourg, our interest is primarily Ward 1 Port Hope versus Cobourg, because Cobourg is our baseline for the PVP program. It's a similar community, or we're learning not identical, but similar without a project. We are about monitoring. That is an environmental assessment commitment across the board for this project. We monitor every aspect of the biophysical environment, and we monitor every aspect of this built environment. And property value is part of the socioeconomic environment that we're responsible to monitor. So that's what we do. And we do it monthly, and we do look at just the data you're talking about. We look at list price versus sale price and watch that gap, and we watch it between the communities. Not on a 10-year period, but every single month. We look at days on market data every single month. And what we do find is that it fluctuates, and it's very, very close. We're not seeing any big variances between Cobourg and Port Hope days on market data. We also use days on market data for some of the applications of services the PVP program provides. So it's a really important number. Now, Murray will tell you that he doesn't like looking at days on market data for other purposes, because what realtors can do, and they do it, and it's perfectly legitimate, is that after a property's been listed for a period of time, they may take it off, rest it for a week, 2 weeks, put it back on the market, new price, fresh listing, and then the days on market clock starts again. But that's done in Cobourg and Port Hope. So for our purposes at PVP, days on market data, to see them so close, always in sync, one higher one month, one lower the other month, it does tell us something. So we are looking at all those factors that you are mentioning. What we're incapable of doing, and why we commissioned this report, is this very in-depth, the why, answering the why. Why in 2006-07 did we see these graphs that we create start to diverge? We didn't know why. We were incapable within our day-to-day aspects of the Property Value Protection Program to dig down with 7,000 transactions and look at the difference in housing and the characteristics of the housing and all these other factors. So what I'll explain to you is that this is complementing what we do on a day in and day out basis of the PVP program. It is fundamental to what we do to understand these markets. The Port Hope market that has a project and the similar Cobourg market are baseline that does not have a project.
I mean, these are the preliminary findings. The
Yes.
form is still a draft, obviously almost done but not yet done. Our intention was to complete the draft, have the report completed and
Yep.
those final conclusions, review it, share it with
Yeah.
the Municipality of Port Hope and other key stakeholders, and then release it
Yeah.
in
It'll be a public, we assume it'll.
2012. In light of the fact that there is a presentation, we believe, set for tonight, that will provide some information that we believe is perhaps confusing, some of it perhaps inaccurate. We thought it would be fair to be open and transparent and provide this information now when it's most needed, so that community residents and others have accurate information on this issue.
We can reproduce these numbers, we cannot reproduce these numbers.
Which numbers? The blue
The 2010 backward.
Okay.
Okay. So, is he right? Maybe he's right. I don't know. But what I can tell you is we're having difficulty reproducing his numbers using the same data set. I do know that here, for example, he eliminated all sales over $250,000. I'm not sure why somebody would do that. To me, it's a little bit misleading. We included in our numbers all 7,000 transactions. We pulled out the odd sale. Sometimes real estate agents put in an apartment building and call it a house. We would call the odd sale, but if a house was $50,000, you know, somebody lived in it, and if it was $1 million, it went into our study. With 7,000 transactions, it's mathematically strong enough that you can do a strong analysis. In 1 year, the data set starts to get a little bit smaller, and you're going to have some anomalies. Maybe that's what's happening here with his numbers. I don't know, but I do know the thrust of what he was saying, and it's implying things that our data just does not support. So I think it's important that people.
And I'll just add on that before we take your question, that I think that's very relevant. If in fact his data, where he's getting it from, doesn't include those sales over 250,000, of which we have seen from another slide, there are a much larger number than the last few years in Cobourg.
Right.
Obviously, those sales of 400,000 and more are going to bring up the average.
It might even support his argument, for all I know. I mean, I'm not saying it's right or wrong or good or bad. We're just saying, you know, I think there's a whole lot more rigor behind our work than has ever been done before.
Just to give you a sense, Valerie, we've received approximately 50 PVP claims in over 10 years. I don't think we've had one for loss of rental. Have we had one?
Way back
One for loss of rental, none for mortgage difficulties. 49 have been for loss of value on sale. So that is the element of the PVP program that is exercised regularly.
We can explain, for example, through the housing stock, the differences between the homes themselves that are selling.
Okay.
So, a house with more bedrooms, bathrooms, garages, and so
Okay,
on.
right.
That number alone accounts for about, we can narrow it down to, depending on the year, about 40% of the value. One year it was as high as 40%.
The home itself, what it has. If
What it has, yes.
Okay.
So that's about 40% of the value. We look at tax rates, for example, and that changes from year to year depending on interest rates and a whole bunch of other factors. But if your tax rates are 10% higher in Port Hope than they are in Cobourg, for example, if you had a $2,000 annual tax bill, 10% is $200 a year. $200 a year, you can carry, I'm not sure, $6,000, $7,000 worth of mortgage payments for that amount of money, given current interest rates. So we know that that's going to impact value there. Development charges, it's a little bit different because that impacts the builder more than the homeowner, but it does stimulate a lot of economic development, which in turn gives you jobs and so on. Now, we know that a hospital, for example, we've looked at studies, and all the studies will tell you that hospitals have a positive impact on property values in that community. I mean, I think that's almost axiomatic. Everybody would agree on that. Nobody can agree on the extent of that. So we had a really difficult time with that, and we saw different numbers out there. I think in our study we narrowed it down. We just put in, I think it was 2% as a conservative low number for the impact of the hospital.
Okay.
Commercial development and the jobs that go along with it, such as part-time jobs for kids, second incomes, and so on, has a very positive impact on value too. Again, we looked at all the literature.